You've entered void of rules, a realm where normal constraints cease to exist. But beware, traveller, there is one rule here. You've got to hit subscribe. Seriously, it's the only rule we have. We just reached 1,000 brave souls, and we're hunting for 9,000 more to complete our dark ritual. I mean, reach our next goal, so subscribe. Or don't. But remember, the void remembers those who defy the only rule. Now let's get into today's video. My name is Derek Thompson, and what I'm about to tell you happened 4 months ago in the Nevada desert, though time moves differently here now, and 4 months might as well be 4 centuries or 4 seconds. I'm writing this from a place that exists between worlds, where reality bends like light through water, and the rules of physics are more like gentle suggestions. If you're reading this, it means my words found their way back to the world I once knew, carried by desert winds and digital signals that shouldn't be able to reach across dimensional boundaries. Consider this both a warning and a confession, a testament to the price of knowledge and the weight of responsibility. I never believed in monsters until I became something far stranger than any monster ever imagined. But let me start at the beginning, when I was still human and thought I understood how the world worked, when my biggest concerns were student loans and finding purpose in a literature degree that seemed increasingly useless in a world that valued efficiency over beauty. I took the night shift at Moonlight Gas Go, not out of desperation, but out of genuine love for the solitude that darkness provided. While others feared the empty hours between midnight and dawn, I found them sacred. There's something profound about being awake when the rest of the world sleeps, about existing in the quiet spaces between one day and the next. I'd always been a creature of the night, preferring the company of books and stars to the harsh fluorescent reality of daytime employment. After graduating with a literature degree from the University of Nevada, I'd spent months applying for editorial positions and teaching jobs, only to receive form rejection letters that praised my qualifications, while explaining they'd chosen someone with more experience. The irony wasn't lost on me. I needed experience to get a job, but needed a job to get experience. It was a closed loop that seemed designed to exclude dreamers like me, who believed that words mattered more than profit margins. The job posting for the Moonlight Gas Go appeared on a Tuesday evening in late September, buried deep in the classified section of a local paper I picked up at a coffee shop. Night shift attendant wanted, excellent pay for minimal work, must be comfortable working alone in isolated location, previous experience with unusual customer service situations preferred, but not required. The phrase unusual customer service situations intrigued me. Having worked retail throughout college, I thought I'd encountered every type of difficult customer imaginable. How unusual could gas station customers be? The station was located on Highway 50, that long stretch of Nevada asphalt that locals called the loneliest road in America. 43 miles from the nearest town of Silverton, it served as a vital lifeline for cross-country travelers and the few ranchers who scraped out a living from the unforgiving desert landscape. The building itself was unremarkable, a standard convenience store attached to 4 gas pumps, surrounded by scrubland and ancient Joshua trees that twisted towards the star-filled sky like arthritic hands frozen in perpetual supplication to gods that had long since stopped listening. Mrs. Holloway owned the station, though I would later learn she'd inherited far more than just a business. She was a woman in her mid-70s with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and pale blue eyes that seemed to hold decades of secrets she'd rather forget. When I called to inquire about the position, her voice carried a weariness that suggested she'd made this conversation many times before. "Can you come in tomorrow afternoon for an interview?" she asked. "I prefer to discuss the position in person. There are aspects of the job that are difficult to explain over the phone." I drove out the next day, Wednesday afternoon, following Highway 50 through landscape that grew increasingly desolate as I left civilization behind. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by the occasional Joshua tree or cluster of weathered boulders that looked like ancient monuments to forgotten civilizations. The sky was that particular shade of blue you only see in places where human light pollution hasn't dimmed the cosmos. So vast and empty, it made me feel simultaneously insignificant and profoundly connected to something larger than myself. The Moonlight Gas Go appeared like a mirage, its fluorescent signs creating a small island of artificial light in an ocean of natural beauty. During daylight hours, it looked exactly like what it was supposed to be, a roadside convenience store serving travelers and locals. But even in the afternoon sun, something about the place felt different, as if it existed slightly out of phase with the rest of reality. Mrs. Holloway greeted me at the door, and I was immediately struck by the intensity of her gaze. Her eyes held the kind of depth that comes from seeing things most people would dismiss as impossible, and when she shook my hand, her grip was surprisingly strong for someone her age. "Derek Thompson," she said, as if testing how my name sounded in the desert air. "You're younger than I expected. Most people your age aren't interested in working alone through the night." I explained my preference for solitude, my love of reading during quiet hours, and my belief that night shift work would give me time to write the novel I'd been outlining since graduation. She listened without interruption, occasionally nodding, as if my answers confirmed something she'd already suspected. "The previous night attendant lasted 3 days," she said, leading me to her small office behind the main counter. "Before him, we had someone who managed 2 weeks. Before that, a young woman who made it almost a month before." She paused, choosing her words carefully, before she decided the job wasn't a good fit. She gestured for me to sit in a worn leather chair across from her desk, then reached into a drawer and withdrew a crumpled piece of paper. This is what the 3-day employee left behind. The handwriting was shaky, almost frantic, as if written by someone whose hands couldn't stop trembling. "Can't do it anymore. They're getting bolder. The rules aren't enough. Tell the next guy to watch for the signs. The scratching is getting louder. They know I can see them now. Mrs. H, the coffee machine timer is off by 30 seconds. Fix it before someone else gets hurt." I stared at the note, waiting for an explanation that never came. Mrs. Holloway simply folded her hands and watched me with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see straight through to my soul. "Night shift work can be challenging," she said carefully. "The isolation affects people differently. Some find it peaceful. Others discover that the darkness holds things they weren't prepared to encounter. Are you sure you're prepared for that level of responsibility?" I assured her I was, thinking of drunk truckers and petty thieves, maybe the occasional wildlife encounter. How difficult could running a desert gas station be? I'd read Cormac McCarthy and understood that the desert could be harsh and unforgiving, but I was drawn to that harshness, that honesty. The desert didn't lie or pretend to be something it wasn't. Mrs. Holloway studied me for a long moment, then seemed to reach some internal decision. "The pay is $15 an hour, plus a night differential that brings it to $22. Health insurance after 90 days. Paid vacation after 6 months. The shift runs from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., Sunday through Thursday." The money was better than anything I'd been offered with my literature degree, and the schedule would leave my days free for writing. I accepted on the spot, scheduled to start the following Monday. "There's one more thing," she said as I prepared to leave. She reached into her desk drawer and withdrew a laminated card, yellowed at the edges and worn smooth by countless nervous fingers. "There are specific procedures for the night shift. 7 rules you must follow exactly, not approximately, not when convenient, not when they seem unnecessary. Exactly." The card contained 7 numbered items in bold black letters. 1. Never look directly at customers who arrive between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. keep your eyes on the register or your hands. 2. If someone asks for the usual, give them a pack of Marlboro Reds and $3.47 in change, even if they pay with exact money. 3. The coffee machine must be turned off at exactly 1:30 a.m. and turned back on at 4:30 a.m. Do not serve coffee during this window, regardless of customer requests. 4. If you hear scratching on the roof, play the radio on station 104.7 FM at maximum volume for exactly 7 minutes. 5. Never unlock the bathroom door for anyone between midnight and dawn. Tell them it's out of order. 6. If a customer's reflection doesn't appear in the security monitor, but you can see them directly, offer them a free energy drink and ask them to leave. 7. The storage room door stays locked after 11 p.m. If you hear sounds from inside, ignore them completely. I read through the list twice, certain this was some elaborate prank played on new employees. The rules seemed absurd, arbitrary guidelines that served no logical purpose. They read like something from a creepypasta or urban legend, the kind of thing college students would make up to scare each other during late-night storytelling sessions. "I know how they sound," Mrs. Holloway said quietly, watching my reaction with the intensity of a scientist observing a crucial experiment. "Every new hire thinks the same thing. They laugh or roll their eyes or assume it's some kind of hazing ritual. But Derek, I need you to understand something that might save your life." She leaned forward, her weathered hands clasped tightly together. "These aren't company policies designed to make your life difficult. They're not practical jokes or arbitrary restrictions created by a management company that's never worked a night shift. These rules are the only thing standing between you and something that has been hungry for a very long time." The sincerity in her voice sent chills down my spine that had nothing to do with the desert evening air. There was something in her eyes, a haunted quality that spoke of experiences no human should have to endure. "What kind of something?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. "The kind of something that looks human enough to fool you until it's too late," she replied. "The kind that knows exactly what to say to make you doubt the rules, to convince you that just this once, just for a moment, it would be safe to look directly at them, or unlock that bathroom door, or serve coffee during the forbidden hours." I slipped the card into my wallet next to my driver's license and the business card of a literary agent who'd never returned my calls. Mrs. Holloway spent the next 2 hours walking me through normal operations, register functions, inventory management, cleaning procedures, how to handle the antiquated security system that recorded everything on actual VHS tapes. These mundane activities made the rules seem even more bizarre by comparison. How could a job that involved selling candy bars and coffee to late-night travelers require such specific and seemingly arbitrary restrictions? "One more thing," she said as I prepared to leave. The sun was setting behind the Joshua trees, painting the desert in shades of orange and purple that would have made Georgia O'Keeffe weep with envy. If something happens that you can't explain, something that makes you question reality itself, don't try to rationalize it. Don't look for logical explanations or scientific reasoning. Don't assume you're hallucinating or suffering from sleep deprivation. Just follow the rules and trust that they'll keep you safe. She walked me to my car, a 10-year-old Honda Civic that looked embarrassingly out of place in the vast desert landscape. "The desert has its own logic," she said, gazing out at the darkening horizon. "Things exist here that can't exist anywhere else, survive here in ways that shouldn't be possible. Respect that logic, follow the rules, and you might last longer than the others." I drove home through the gathering darkness, my mind spinning with questions I couldn't answer and warnings I couldn't quite dismiss. The rational part of my brain insisted the rules were nonsense, probably left over from some previous owner who had a peculiar sense of humour, but something deeper, more primal, whispered warnings that echoed through my bones like genetic memory of ancient fears. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling of my studio apartment, unable to shake the feeling that I'd just agreed to something far more significant than a simple job. The laminated card sat on my nightstand, those 7 rules, glowing faintly in the darkness cast by my digital clock. Outside, the city lights created their usual orange haze against the night sky, but I found myself longing for the pure darkness of the desert, for stars that weren't dimmed by human ambition. I spent the weekend reading about Highway 50, about the history of the Nevada desert, about the folklore and legends that had grown up around one of America's most isolated roads. Most of what I found was standard tourist information. Ghost towns and mining history, stories of pioneers who died of thirst or exposure while trying to cross the unforgiving landscape. But buried deeper, in forums and obscure websites maintained by people who claimed to have experienced things that couldn't be easily explained, I found stranger stories. Tales of travellers who'd encountered gas stations that weren't on any map, of convenience store clerks who gave cryptic warnings about following rules that made no sense, of customers who paid with money that crumbled to dust in the morning light. Most people dismiss these stories as urban legends or the hallucinations of drivers suffering from highway hypnosis. But after meeting Mrs. Holloway, after seeing the haunted look in her eyes and the genuine fear in her voice, I wasn't so quick to dismiss anything. Monday evening arrived with the slow inevitability of a desert sunset. I drove out to the Moonlight Gas Go as the last light faded from the western sky. My Honda's headlights cutting through darkness that seemed deeper and more complete than any I'd experienced in the city. The desert at night was a different world entirely, vast and ancient and utterly indifferent to human concerns. I arrived at 9:45 p.m. to find Tommy, the day shift clerk, practically vibrating with nervous energy. He was a wiry man in his 50s who'd worked at the station for over a decade, but I'd never seen anyone so eager to leave a job they'd presumably grown comfortable with. "You the new night guy?" he asked, not waiting for an answer as he grabbed his jacket and keys. "Good luck, kid. Follow the rules exactly. Not mostly, not when it's convenient exactly, and you might last longer than the others." Before I could ask what he meant by the others, he was gone, his taillights disappearing into the darkness faster than seemed safe on the winding desert highway. I was left alone with the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of wind moving through Joshua trees like whispered conversations in a language I didn't recognize. The first few hours of my first shift passed quietly, almost anticlimactically. A few long-haul truckers stopped for coffee and snacks, their headlights cutting brief swathes through the darkness before vanishing down the empty road. I familiarized myself with the layout of the store, restocked the coolers with energy drinks and beer, and tried to ignore the way the fluorescent lights seemed to flicker whenever the wind picked up outside. The store was larger than it appeared from the highway, with aisles of snack foods, automotive supplies, and the kind of random merchandise that desert travelers might need in emergencies. Cheap flashlights, blankets, basic tools, even a small selection of camping gear. Behind the main counter was a coffee station, a hot food warmer that held rotating selections of questionable burritos and corn dogs, and the security monitor that showed feeds from 4 cameras positioned around the store and parking lot. At 1:30 a.m, I dutifully turned off the coffee machine, though it seemed wasteful to deny potential customers their caffeine fix. The machine was an old commercial model that probably dated back to the 1980s, with analog dials and switches that required manual operation rather than digital programming. As I flipped the power switch, the sudden silence felt different somehow. Deeper, more complete, as if the world itself had taken a breath and forgotten how to exhale. Nothing unusual happened that first night, and by morning I was convinced the rules were an elaborate hazing ritual designed to test new employees' willingness to follow arbitrary instructions. I completed my shift without incident, locked up the store according to Mrs. Holloway's detailed checklist, and drove home through the dawn light feeling confident about my new job. The desert looked different in the morning, somehow less mysterious and more desolate. The romance of the star-filled night sky gave way to harsh reality, endless stretches of scrubland punctuated by roadkill, and the occasional abandoned vehicle that had been stripped for parts by practical-minded locals. But even in daylight, I felt drawn to the vast emptiness, to the honesty of a landscape that made no promises it couldn't keep. The second night shattered my confidence completely. I arrived for my shift feeling relaxed and prepared, armed with a paperback novel and a thermos of coffee to supplement the store's supply. The first few hours passed uneventfully, just like the previous night. A handful of customers came and went, truckers, insomniacs, people driving through the night for reasons they didn't share with a convenience store clerk. Around 11:45 p.m, I heard soft knocking on the bathroom door. I looked up from my book, a worn copy of Blood Meridian that seemed appropriate for the desert setting, to see a woman standing near the restroom entrance. She appeared to be in her 40s, wearing a faded floral dress that looked like it belonged in a different decade entirely. Her hair was perfectly coiffed despite the late hour, styled in victory rolls that belonged to the 1940s, and her makeup was applied with the precision of a mortician preparing a corpse for viewing. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice carrying a strange echo, despite the small space. "The door seems to be locked." I glanced at the clock. 11:45 p.m. Close enough to midnight that the fifth rule should apply. "I'm sorry, but the bathroom is out of order during night hours. There's a 24-hour truck stop about 15 miles east if you need facilities." The woman turned toward me, and I noticed something fundamentally wrong with her movement. She pivoted, like a mannequin, being rotated on a display stand, her feet never lifting from the floor, her body moving as a single rigid unit. When she faced me directly, I could see that her smile was too wide, stretching her lips thin enough to reveal too many teeth. Not just more teeth than a human mouth should hold, but teeth that were too sharp, too white, arranged in rows like a shark's. "But I just need to wash my hands," she said, and now I could hear that her voice wasn't quite right either. It had a layered quality, as if multiple people were speaking in perfect unison, creating harmonics that shouldn't be possible from a single throat. "I really can't unlock it. Company policy." She stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, perfectly motionless, except for that unnaturally wide smile. Her eyes never blinked, and I began to notice that she wasn't breathing. Her chest never rose or fell, and in the absolute stillness of the desert night, I should have been able to hear the sound of her respiration. Finally, she glided to the counter, and I mean glided, her feet never making contact with the floor, moving with the smooth progress of something on wheels or tracks hidden beneath her dress. She placed a pack of gum on the surface with deliberate precision, arranging it so that the wrapper faced exactly parallel to the edge of the counter. "How much?" she asked, though her lips didn't move quite right when she spoke, as if they were slightly out of sync with the words. I rang up the gum, my hands trembling slightly as I tried to maintain the illusion of normalcy. $1.59. She placed exact change on the counter, each coin perfectly clean and shining as if freshly minted, arranged in a neat line according to denomination. As she reached for her purchase, I noticed her fingers were wrong. Too long, with too many joints that bent at angles that made my eyes water to look at directly. Her skin had a waxy quality that reminded me of department store mannequins, and when she touched the gum package, I could hear a faint crackling sound like cellophane being crumpled. "Thank you," she said, her voice now carrying those impossible harmonics that seemed to come from multiple throats speaking in perfect unison. "You're learning." She walked towards the door with that same gliding motion, and the automatic door opened without her approaching the sensor range. As she stepped into the parking lot, she seemed to lose coherence, her form becoming less distinct until she disappeared entirely into the darkness beyond the reach of the fluorescent lights. I watched for her car, but no engine started, no headlights appeared. She had simply vanished into the desert night as if she'd never existed at all. I spent the rest of my shift trying to rationalize what I'd seen, constructing elaborate explanations involving optical illusions, sleep deprivation, and the psychological effects of isolation. But the gun package remained on the counter where she'd left it, and the coins she'd used to pay for it were still in the register drawer, real and solid, and impossible to dismiss as hallucination. More importantly, I'd followed the rule without really thinking about it, some instinct deeper than rational thought recognizing that opening that bathroom door would have been a mistake beyond calculation. The third night brought my first encounter with the 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. restriction, and with it, a deeper understanding of why some rules exist beyond human comprehension. At 2:17 a.m., the door chime announced the customer's arrival. Following the first rule, I kept my eyes focused on the register display as footsteps approached the counter. The sound was wrong, not the normal rhythm of human walking, but something that suggested a gate evolved for different terrain, different gravity, different laws of physics entirely. "Pack of cigarettes," the customer said, and immediately I understood why I wasn't supposed to look. The voice was human enough on the surface, but underneath it I could hear something else. A wet, sliding sound like a massive slug, moving across gravel, and harmonics that suggested vocal cords arranged in impossible configurations. I grabbed a pack of Marlboro lights from the display behind me, keeping my gaze fixed downward like a monk in prayer. "What brand would you prefer?" "Any brand will suffice for our purposes." The phrase "our purposes" made my skin crawl, suggesting plurality in what appeared to be a single customer. I rang up the cigarettes and stated the total, extending my hand to receive payment while carefully avoiding any upward glance that might violate the rule. When the customer placed money in my palm, the bills felt wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. They were too smooth, too warm, and slightly damp, as if they'd been kept somewhere humid and organic. The texture reminded me of skin that had been soaked in water too long, and they carried a faint smell like ozone mixed with decay. The contact lasted only seconds, but it was enough to make every nerve in my body scream warnings about the fundamental wrongness of whatever had touched me. "Keep the change," the customer said, though the amount had been exact to the penny. I forced myself to remain motionless until I heard the door chime, signal the customer's departure. Only then did I allow myself to look up, and through the windows I caught a glimpse of something that challenged the basic assumptions I'd made about the nature of reality. Whatever was moving away from the store didn't walk so much as flow, its form undulating with liquid grace that suggested a body plan evolved for environments that didn't exist on Earth. It moved at the very edge of the parking lot lights, never quite coming into full illumination, but what I could see defied easy description. It seemed to exist in more dimensions than my eyes could process, folding in on itself in ways that made my brain ache to observe. But the most disturbing aspect wasn't its alien nature, it was how perfectly it had mimicked human speech, how easily it had assumed the role of a normal customer making a routine purchase. If not for the rule preventing me from looking directly at it, I might never have noticed anything unusual beyond a slightly odd voice and an awkward way of walking. By the end of my first week, I'd learned that each rule served a specific and vital purpose. The coffee machine restriction prevented me from serving something that became violently aggressive when denied its caffeine. A customer who appeared to be a normal trucker but pounded on the counter with fists that left dents in the metal surface, his face contorting with rage that seemed far too intense for the simple denial of coffee. When I explained that the machine was offline for maintenance, he stormed out while muttering in a language that hurt my ears to hear, consonants and vowel sounds that human vocal cords weren't designed to produce. The scratching on the roof came every night now, always between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., always with the same rhythmic pattern that almost resembled music, if music could be played by claws on metal. When I followed the radio protocol, tuning to 104.7 FM and turning the volume to maximum, the scratching would stop immediately, replaced by heavy footsteps that circled the building 3 times before fading into the distance. One night, curiosity overcame caution, and I made the mistake of looking out the window during the radio ritual. What I saw moving across the roof challenged every assumption I'd made about the laws of physics and biology. It was a shadow that bent light around itself, existing in spaces that shouldn't be able to contain physical matter. The shape suggested something with too many limbs, arranged in configurations that hurt to observe directly, and when it moved, it seemed to fold through dimensions my eyes couldn't follow. The storage room sounds were perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspect of the job. Every night after 11 p.m, I could hear movement behind the locked door. Sometimes the sound of inventory being reorganized by invisible hands. Other times what sounded like multiple people having quiet conversations in languages I didn't recognize. On Thursday night of my first week, I heard what sounded like a child crying, soft whimpering that tugged at every protective instinct I possessed despite having no children of my own. The sounds were so realistic, so heart-wrenching, that I found myself standing before the storage room door with the key in my hand before I remembered the 7th rule. I pressed my ear against the door, straining to hear more clearly. The crying continued, joined by what sounded like a woman's voice trying to provide comfort, speaking in soothing tones that almost sounded like a lullaby. Every human instinct screamed at me to unlock the door and help whoever was trapped inside, but Mrs. Holloway's warning echoed in my mind, like a mantra: follow the rules exactly, no matter what you hear or see. I forced myself to walk away, the sounds following me like accusatory whispers. For the rest of the night, I could hear occasional sobbing from the storage room, punctuated by what sounded like someone calling my name in a voice I almost recognized. Each incident reinforced that the rules weren't arbitrary restrictions or elaborate pranks, but carefully crafted survival instructions written in the blood and madness of previous employees who'd learned their importance too late. Something had established a delicate balance at the Moonlight Gas Go, a set of protocols that allowed beings from incompatible realities to coexist in the same physical space without destroying each other. The second week brought more complex encounters that tested my growing understanding of the supernatural ecosystem I'd become part of. I began to notice patterns in the customers' behavior, subtle signs that helped me identify which ones weren't entirely human. The non-human customers moved differently, either too fluid or too rigid, as if they were consciously controlling bodies that didn't quite fit them properly. Their voices carried harmonics that suggested vocal structures evolved for different atmospheric pressures, and their shadows fell in directions that defied the overhead lighting. Most tellingly, they respected the rules as much as I did, as if we were all participants in some ancient contract that benefited both sides. On Monday night of my second week, a customer entered at 3:15 a.m. and approached the counter without speaking. Following the first rule, I kept my eyes focused on my hands, waiting for them to state their business. After several minutes of silence, they finally spoke. I require the usual arrangement. I reached for the Marlboro Reds and counted out $3.47 in change, setting both on the counter without looking up. As the customer reached for the items, I caught a glimpse of their hands in my peripheral vision. Skin that looked like it had been stretched over bones that were too long, with joints that bent backward at angles that defied human anatomy. "Your compliance is noted and appreciated," the customer said in a voice like wind moving through deep caves. "Others before you have shown less understanding." The customer left without another word, but I understood that I'd just passed some kind of test, that my willingness to follow the rules without question had earned me a measure of protection from whatever forces moved through the desert night. Tuesday brought a new and more unsettling challenge. A woman entered during safe hours around 9:30 p.m. and browsed the aisles for several minutes. She appeared completely normal. Appropriate movements, natural voice, logical responses to my polite greetings about the weather and road conditions. She selected snacks and beverages like any other late-night traveller, chatting casually about her drive across the desert and her plans to reach California by morning. It wasn't until she approached the counter that I noticed the problem. As I rang up her purchases, I glanced at the security monitor out of habit and felt my blood turn to ice water. The screen showed an empty store, just me standing behind the counter, apparently talking to myself and ringing up invisible items. I looked directly at the woman, confirming she was standing right in front of me. Solid and real, and impossible to dismiss as hallucination. Then I looked back at the monitor. Still nothing but empty aisles and a confused-looking clerk staring at nothing. My hands trembled as I reached under the counter for a complimentary energy drink, following the 6th rule despite the surreal nature of the situation. "Here," I said, offering it to her, "on the house, but I'm going to have to ask you to leave now." Her expression never changed, still that pleasant, perfectly normal smile that belonged on a suburban soccer mum or small-town librarian. "Of course. Thank you for the hospitality and the warning." She took the energy drink and walked toward the door, which opened without her approaching the sensor range. "You're learning the protocols much faster than most. That's encouraging." As she stepped into the parking lot, she began to fade like morning mist, becoming translucent before disappearing entirely. The only evidence of her visit was the energy drink she'd taken, and the faint scent of ozone that lingered in the air like the aftermath of lightning strikes. Wednesday night brought multiple encounters with the bathroom rule, each more intense than the last. The first customer, a middle-aged man in a business suit, knocked politely on the door at 12:15 a.m. and asked if I could unlock it for him. "I'm sorry, but the bathroom is out of order during night hours," I explained, following the script I'd memorized. "I understand company policies," he replied reasonably, "but I'm having a medical emergency. Surely you can make an exception for health reasons." His request sounded perfectly logical, the kind of appeal to human compassion that any reasonable person would honor. But something in his voice carried a subtle wrongness, a harmony that suggested multiple speakers coordinating their words with inhuman precision. "I really can't unlock it. There's a truck stop about 15 miles east that has facilities." As my refusal became clear, his appearance began to change in subtle ways. His face elongated slightly, his eyes sank deeper into his skull, and his voice took on that familiar harmonic quality I'd learned to associate with the not-human customers. "I see," he said, straightening his tie with fingers that had too many joints. "Perhaps I'll find what I need elsewhere." He walked out without another word, his movements becoming more fluid and less human-like as he reached the door. The second bathroom customer arrived at 1:30 a.m., a young woman in travelling clothes who seemed genuinely distressed. She knocked urgently on the door, calling out that she really needed to use the facilities. "I'm sorry, but it's out of order," I said, hating myself for denying help to someone who appeared to be in genuine need. "Please," she begged, her voice carrying what sounded like real desperation. "I've been driving for hours, and there's nowhere else for miles." This was the most difficult test yet. A customer who seemed completely human, whose distress appeared genuine, whose request was entirely reasonable. Every instinct told me to help her, to show basic human decency and unlock the door. But Mrs. Holloway's warning echoed in my mind. These things know exactly what to say, to make you doubt the rules. I forced myself to repeat the script about the truck stop, even as the woman's pleas became more frantic. After several minutes, she stopped mid-sentence and straightened up, her distressed expression vanishing, like a mask being removed. "Interesting," she said in a voice completely different from the one she'd been using moments before. "Your resistance to emotional manipulation is stronger than average." She walked away with movements that were too smooth, too graceful, like a dancer who'd learned to move in lower gravity. At the door, she paused and looked back at me with eyes that reflected the fluorescent lights like an animal's. "The bathroom rule exists for a very good reason," she said. "What's behind that door at night isn't meant for human eyes. Remember that." The third bathroom customer was the most terrifying yet. At 3:45 a.m., something that had once been human pounded on the door with increasing violence, demanding entry in a voice that grew less human with each word. Whatever was speaking sounded like it was in tremendous pain, as if the very act of forming human words was causing it physical agony. The pounding continued for 20 minutes, growing more frantic, accompanied by sounds that suggested claws scraping against metal and wood. Finally, the sounds stopped abruptly, replaced by a whispered voice that seemed to come from right beside my ear, despite the distance. "Thank you," it said, and the gratitude in that inhuman voice was so profound it brought tears to my eyes. "You saved us both tonight." By Thursday, I'd developed coping strategies that helped me maintain some semblance of sanity in an increasingly insane job. I kept a small mirror angled to watch customers without looking directly at them during danger hours. I pre-counted the $3.47 in change and kept Marlboro Reds easily accessible on the counter. I wore noise-cancelling headphones to muffle the storage room sounds, though even through multiple layers of audio protection I could feel vibrations that suggested something massive, moving around in spaces that shouldn't be able to contain physical matter. The scratching on the roof had evolved from simple scraping into complex rhythms that almost resembled music. If music could be played by claws on metal and composed according to harmonic principles that predated human civilization. The radio solution continued to work perfectly, but I began to notice that the static before the music started contained voices whispering in languages that made my teeth ache to hear. More disturbing was the growing realization that whatever was on the roof was trying to communicate, that the scratching patterns were becoming more sophisticated each night. Sometimes the rhythm sounded almost like Morse code, other times like the complex polyrhythms of African drumming translated into a medium of claws and metal. As I entered my third week, I felt a growing sense of mastery over the bizarre requirements of my job. I developed an almost supernatural ability to identify which customers were human and which weren't, reading subtle cues in their movement patterns, voice modulations, and the way shadows fell around their forms. The non-human customers had begun to acknowledge my competence with nods of approval or brief comments about my improved understanding of the protocols. Mrs. Holloway seemed genuinely surprised by my success during our brief afternoon meetings. She'd begun to relax slightly, though the worried expression never completely left her face. "You're doing exceptionally well," she said on Monday afternoon of my third week, settling into her office chair with the careful movements of someone who'd learned to expect unpleasant surprises. "Better than any night clerk we've had in years. Most don't make it past the first week without at least one serious violation." "What happens when someone violates the rules?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Mrs. Holloway was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the Joshua trees that twisted against the afternoon sky like arthritic fingers. "It depends on which rule they break. and how willing they are to learn from the experience, she said finally. Some mistakes can be survived. Others, she gestured towards the empty store, others require a different kind of payment. She reached into her desk drawer and withdrew a thick folder filled with employment records. We've had 47 night clerks over the past 15 years, she said, flipping through pages covered with names, dates, and brief notes. The average tenure is 11 days. The longest anyone lasted was 8 months. A woman named Patricia, who understood the rules instinctively and never questioned their necessity. What happened to her? She retired, Mrs. Holloway said, but something in her voice suggested the story was more complicated than that simple explanation implied. Moved to Arizona and opened a small bookstore. She still sends Christmas cards. I felt a surge of hope at this evidence that it was possible to survive the job and move on to normal life, but Mrs. Holloway seemed to read my thoughts. Patricia was unique, she said carefully. She had experiences before working here that prepared her for what she'd encounter. Most people aren't so fortunate. She closed the folder and looked at me with those penetrating blue eyes. Derek, I need you to understand something important. The confidence you're developing, the sense that you've mastered the rules and can handle anything this job throws at you. That confidence is dangerous. The moment you think you understand these things completely is the moment they'll surprise you. I assured her I'd remain vigilant, but privately, I was beginning to feel proud of my perfect record. I'd followed every rule exactly, handled every strange situation with appropriate caution, and even begun to feel a strange sense of camaraderie with my unusual clientele. They were bizarre, certainly, but they followed predictable patterns. As long as I maintained my end of whatever bargain the rules represented, they seemed content to conduct their business peacefully. That growing confidence would prove to be my fatal mistake, but not in the way I expected. The third week brought encounters that were more complex and revealing than anything I'd experienced before. It was as if my consistent rule-following had earned me access to deeper levels of the supernatural ecosystem that operated around the Moonlight Gas Go. On Tuesday night, I had my first extended conversation with one of the non-human customers. At 3:20 a.m, a figure entered who appeared to be an elderly man in a worn suit that might have been fashionable in the 1950s. Following protocol, I kept my eyes down as he approached the counter. "Good evening, Derek," he said, and his use of my name sent chills down my spine. "I trust you're finding the work educational." "Can I help you with something?" I asked, maintaining my downward gaze while reaching for the Marlboro Reds, in case this was a usual request. "No purchase necessary tonight," he replied, his voice carrying harmonics that suggested vocal cords arranged in impossible configurations. "I merely wish to express appreciation for your dedication to the protocols. So few of your kind understand the importance of the balance we maintain here." Balance? Between worlds, between realities, between forms of existence that were never meant to occupy the same space, he explained, and I could hear something like sadness in that inhuman voice. "This place serves as more than a way station for travelers, Derek. It's a carefully maintained embassy, a neutral ground where beings like myself can interact with your species without causing the kind of damage that occurs when incompatible realities collide. I wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but something told me that this conversation was a privilege that could be revoked if I pushed too hard. Instead, I simply listened as the entity that looked like an elderly man continued speaking. "The rules you follow so diligently aren't arbitrary restrictions. They're the terms of a treaty negotiated over decades, written in the blood of those who learned their importance too late. Each rule prevents a specific type of catastrophic interaction between our kinds." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you've earned the right to understand," he said. "Your consistent compliance has demonstrated respect for forces beyond your comprehension. That respect is rare among your species." The entity paused, and I could hear what sounded like wind moving through vast spaces. But knowledge brings responsibility, Derek. Now that you understand the true nature of your role here, the consequences of failure become more severe. You're no longer just a convenience store clerk. You're a guardian of the boundary between worlds. He left without another word, but his visit marked a turning point in my understanding of the job. I wasn't just serving strange customers and following weird rules. I was maintaining a cosmic balance that kept incompatible realities from destroying each other. Wednesday brought an encounter that revealed even more about the complex ecosystem I'd become part of. At 2:45 a.m, multiple customers entered simultaneously, something that had never happened during the danger hours before. There were 5 of them, each distinctly non-human, in ways that my peripheral vision could detect, but not fully process. They moved through the store with purpose, selecting items with the precision of a choreographed dance. One went to the automotive section, another to the snack aisle, a third to the coolers. They worked in perfect coordination, never speaking, but somehow communicating through methods I couldn't detect. When they approached the counter, I kept my eyes down as they placed their selections before me. The items seemed random: motor oil, beef jerky, energy drinks, a roadmap of Nevada, and a pack of gum. But as I rang them up, I noticed that the total came to exactly $23.47. The usual arrangement, one of them said in a voice like grinding stone. I provided the Marlboro Reds and counted out $3.47 in change, though they'd already paid the exact amount. The mathematics made no sense, but I'd learned not to apply human logic to these interactions. The balance holds, another voice said, this one sounding like wind through empty buildings. The compact remains intact. They left as suddenly as they'd arrived, taking their purchases and leaving behind only the faint scent of ozone and something else, something wild and ancient that didn't belong to this world. Thursday night brought the most revelatory encounter yet. At exactly 3 a.m, a figure entered who appeared to be a woman in her 30s, dressed in clothing that seemed to shift styles depending on the angle from which I viewed it. Sometimes it looked like a modern business suit, other times like a Victorian dress, occasionally like robes that belonged to no earthly culture. "Derek Thompson," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that sounded almost musical. "You've exceeded all expectations. Your adaptation to the protocols has been remarkable." "Thank you," I said, unsure how else to respond to praise from something that clearly wasn't human. "I represent what you might call the administrative authority for this region," she continued. "The entities responsible for maintaining the agreements that allow places like this to exist. We've been watching your progress with great interest." She moved closer to the counter, and I caught glimpses of her in my peripheral vision that made my brain ache. She seemed to exist in more dimensions than my eyes could process, folding through spaces that shouldn't be able to contain physical matter. "The previous clerk showed promise initially," she said, "but ultimately proved unable to maintain the level of discipline required for long-term success. Before him, we had a young woman who lasted almost a month before her curiosity overcame her caution. Before that..." She trailed off, but I understood. I was just the latest in a long line of humans who tried to serve as guardians of this cosmic boundary, and most had failed. "What makes this place special?" I asked, risking a question that might be inappropriate. "Confluence," she replied immediately, as if she'd been waiting for me to ask. "This location sits at the intersection of multiple dimensional layers, a point where the barriers between realities are naturally thin. Without proper management, it would be a catastrophic weak spot where incompatible forms of existence would bleed through and destroy each other." She gestured towards the windows, where the desert stretched endlessly under star-filled skies. "Your species sees empty wasteland, but we see a vital nexus point that requires constant monitoring and careful regulation. The gas station provides the perfect cover, a legitimate business that attracts the steady flow of human traffic necessary to maintain the balance. Balance between what exactly? Between worlds that should never touch, realities that operate according to incompatible physical laws, forms of consciousness that would drive each other to madness through mere proximity, she explained. The rules you follow create a buffer zone, a set of protocols that allow limited interaction without catastrophic consequences. I wanted to ask more questions, but she seemed to sense that she'd already shared more information than was typical for these encounters. Continue as you have been, she said, beginning to fade like morning mist. Follow the rules exactly, maintain the balance, and you might survive long enough to move on to other responsibilities. But remember, knowledge brings obligation. You can never again claim ignorance of what you're truly protecting. She vanished completely, leaving behind only the faint scent of ozone and something that might have been incense burned in temples to gods whose names were forgotten before human civilization began. The encounter left me with a profound sense of the weight of my responsibilities. I was no longer just a night shift clerk earning money while pursuing my literary ambitions. I was a guardian of cosmic boundaries, a keeper of treaties written in languages that predated human speech. But with understanding came a dangerous sense of confidence. I'd proven myself capable of handling situations that had driven previous clerks to madness or worse. I'd earned the respect of entities that existed beyond human comprehension. Most importantly, I'd maintained perfect compliance with the rules for 3 full weeks without a single violation. That confidence was about to be tested in ways I couldn't imagine. Friday of my 3rd week arrived with unseasonable weather, a storm system that brought heavy clouds and intermittent rain to the usually bone-dry desert. The change in atmospheric pressure seemed to affect the supernatural ecosystem around the station, making the non-human customers more active and unpredictable than usual. I'd been pulling double shifts all week to cover for Tommy, who called in sick with what management euphemistically termed stress-related illness. The truth was that even the day shift had become challenging as more entities began manifesting during daylight hours, drawn by whatever cosmic forces were converging on the location. By Friday night, I'd been awake for nearly 20 hours straight, surviving on a dangerous combination of energy drinks, coffee, and the kind of adrenaline that comes from constant exposure to existential terror. My hands shook with caffeine tremors, my vision blurred at the edges, and I began to experience the mild hallucinations that come with extreme sleep deprivation, shadows moving in my peripheral vision, voices calling my name from empty rooms. The storm reached its peak around midnight, bringing rain that drummed against the windows with unusual intensity and wind that howled through the Joshua trees like the voices of lost souls. The fluorescent lights flickered more frequently than usual, and the security monitors occasionally displayed static that looked almost like faces screaming in languages I didn't recognize. Despite my exhaustion, the first few hours of the shift proceeded normally. I handled several routine encounters with non-human customers, successfully navigated the coffee machine protocol, and managed 2 separate incidents involving the bathroom rule. Everything was proceeding according to the established patterns, and I began to allow myself to feel confident about completing another successful shift. That confidence was my first mistake. At 2:15 a.m., I experienced my first really close call. A customer entered who appeared to be a normal trucker, middle-aged, wearing clothes appropriate for long-distance driving, moving with the slightly stiff gait of someone who'd been sitting behind a wheel for hours, but something about his timing and appearance triggered my newly developed supernatural awareness. Following protocol, I kept my eyes down as he approached the counter, but in my exhausted state, my peripheral vision caught more details than it should have. His shadow fell in the wrong direction, stretching towards a light source that didn't exist. His reflection in the security monitor seemed to lag slightly behind his actual movements, as if the image was being transmitted across vast distances. "Pack of cigarettes," he said, and his voice sounded perfectly normal. No strange harmonics, no impossible echoes. But something felt wrong. The timing was too perfect, too precisely calculated to test my resolve during a moment of weakness. I reached for the Marlboro lights, then hesitated. What if this was a human customer? What if my paranoia was causing me to misidentify a normal person as something supernatural? The hesitation lasted only seconds, but it was enough to create doubt where there should have been certainty. I grabbed the cigarettes and rang them up, still keeping my eyes down but increasingly uncertain about the nature of the customer I was serving. "What brand?" I asked, following the script I'd memorized. "Marlboro lights will be fine," he replied, and something in his tone suggested amusement at my confusion. I completed the transaction without incident, but the encounter left me shaken. For the first time since starting the job, I'd experienced doubt about my ability to correctly identify supernatural customers. The certainty that had carried me through 3 weeks of successful rule following had been replaced by uncertainty that gnawed at my confidence, like acid. The second close call came at 3:30 a.m, when exhaustion finally overcame my caffeine-fueled alertness. I was slumped over the counter, fighting to keep my eyes open, when I heard the familiar scratching on the roof. The sound was more intense than usual, as if whatever was up there was trying to claw through the metal surface. I reached for the radio controls, but my trembling hands fumbled with the dial. Instead of tuning to 104.7 FM, I accidentally landed on 104.5, flooding the store with static and emergency broadcast signals. The scratching above grew more frantic, accompanied by sounds that suggested something large and angry, pacing back and forth across the roof. I corrected my mistake within seconds, finding the right frequency and turning the volume to maximum. The scratching stopped immediately, but not before I'd heard something that sounded like my name being called from above in a voice that carried harmonics of barely contained rage. The radio played country music for the required 7 minutes, but I could feel something watching me from outside, something that had noticed my mistake and was evaluating whether it constituted a rule violation significant enough to void my protection. When the 7 minutes ended and I turned off the radio, the desert silence that followed felt different, heavier, more oppressive, charged with potential violence that had been barely avoided. These near misses should have made me more cautious, but instead they had the opposite effect. I'd come close to violating the rules, but had recovered quickly enough to avoid consequences. If anything, successfully navigating these challenges reinforced my growing confidence in my ability to handle the job's requirements. That confidence became complacency, and complacency became the foundation for my ultimate failure. By 2 a.m. on Friday night, the combination of exhaustion, caffeine crash, and 3 weeks of accumulated stress had pushed me to the edge of my physical and mental limits. I'd been awake for nearly 24 hours, covering not just my regular shift, but helping with inventory and maintenance during the day. The extra money was so substantial, but the toll on my body and mind was becoming severe. I should have called Mrs. Holloway and requested backup. I should have recognized that I was too impaired to safely perform a job that required absolute precision and unwavering attention to detail, but pride and overconfidence convinced me that I could push through one more shift, that my experience and proven track record would carry me through whatever challenges the night might bring. That hubris would prove to be my downfall. At 2:23 a.m, as rain drummed against the windows and wind howled through the desert like the voices of the damned, the door chime announced a new customer. I was slumped over the counter, my head resting in my hands as I fought against waves of dizziness and nausea that came with extreme exhaustion. The sound of footsteps on linoleum jolted me partially awake, and I looked up groggily to see a customer approaching the counter. It was a tall man in a worn leather jacket, moving with the measured pace of someone who had all the time in the world. His footsteps clicked against the floor with the precision of a metronome, each sound echoing slightly in the fluorescent-lit space. "Pack of cigarettes," he said, and his voice sounded perfectly normal. No strange harmonics, no impossible echoes, no wet sliding sounds that suggested inhuman vocal cords. Just a regular customer making a routine purchase at an unfortunate time. In my exhausted, disoriented state, muscle memory and years of customer service training took over. 3 weeks of supernatural encounters hadn't erased decades of social conditioning that demanded I look at customers, when they spoke to me, that I provide the kind of personal service that kept people coming back. I automatically looked up to ask what brand he preferred. Making direct eye contact before my sleep-fogged brain remembered what time it was, and what rule I'd just catastrophically violated. The moment our gazes met, I knew I'd made a mistake that couldn't be undone. His eyes were completely black, not just the pupils dilated from the dim lighting, but the entire visible surface transformed into portals that led to spaces between stars. Looking into them was like staring into the void that existed before the universe began. Into darkness so absolute, it had weight and texture and malevolent intelligence. As our gazes locked, his face began to change in ways that violated every law of biology and physics I'd ever learned. The skin rippled and flowed like liquid mercury, stretching over bones that lengthened and sharpened with wet, crackling sounds. His mouth widened into a smile that revealed rows of teeth like broken obsidian, each one reflecting the fluorescent lights with predatory gleam that spoke of hunger beyond human comprehension. "You looked," he said, and his voice transformed into something that sounded like grinding continental plates, and the screams of dying stars given the power of speech. The full horror of my situation crashed over me like ice water, washing away 3 weeks of carefully maintained confidence. In a single moment of terror so pure, it transcended normal human experience. After maintaining perfect rule compliance for 21 days, one moment of exhaustion-induced carelessness had undone everything I'd worked to achieve. I fumbled for the Marlboro Reds with hands that shook so violently I could barely grip the package, my movements clumsy with panic and sleep deprivation. "Here," I stammered, counting out the exact change with fingers that felt like they belonged to someone else. "Your usual. Please, I made a mistake. I was tired. I forgot what time it was." The creature that had been wearing a human face tilted its head, studying me with those bottomless black eyes that reflected depths I couldn't fathom. "Too late for that," it said, its voice now carrying harmonics that made my bones ache and my vision blur at the edges. "The compact is broken. You've seen what should not be seen." I tried to run, but my legs had turned to water, refusing to support my weight as terror flooded my system with enough adrenaline to stop my heart. The familiar store around me began to change in ways that hurt to perceive directly, reality bending and warping like heated plastic as the protective barriers maintained by the rules collapsed. The fluorescent lights dimmed and took on colours that had no names in human language, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources and seemed to reach toward me with grasping fingers made of concentrated darkness. The shelves of snack foods and automotive supplies stretched and warped, becoming impossible geometries that folded in on themselves according to mathematical principles that predated Euclidean space. "Please," I begged, my voice breaking with the desperation of someone who finally understood the true scope of their mistake. "I served your kind faithfully for 3 weeks. I followed the rules. I maintained the balance. I respected the treaties. It was just one mistake, one moment of human weakness." The creature laughed, a sound like cosmic wind howling through the ruins of dead civilizations. "One mistake is all it takes, Derek Thompson. You've been an exemplary servant, better than most who've held this position. Your dedication to the protocols was remarkable, your respect for forces beyond your comprehension genuine. But the rules exist for a reason that transcends individual merit or intention." As it spoke, its human disguise continued to dissolve like ice in summer heat. The leather jacket merged with its skin, becoming scales that reflected the dying light like polished obsidian mirrors. Its limbs elongated grotesquely, joints bending in directions that violated the basic principles of anatomy, while somehow remaining graceful in their alien articulation. What stood before me now was something ancient and alien, a being from the spaces between realities that had learned to wear human appearances like poorly fitting costumes designed for stage plays performed before audiences who'd never seen real humans. "What are you?" I whispered, though part of my rapidly fragmenting sanity insisted I didn't want to know the answer to that question. "We are called by many names," it replied, its voice now seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, filling the store with harmonics that made the windows vibrate in their frames. "Your people have called us Skinwalkers, though that term lacks precision and understanding. We are travelers from dying worlds, refugees from realities that collapsed under the weight of their own contradictions, beings who exist in the spaces between what your limited perception considers real." The creature began to circle the counter, moving with fluid grace that was simultaneously beautiful and utterly terrifying to observe. Each step seemed to bend space around it, creating ripples in reality that hurt my eyes to follow. "This place serves as far more than a way station for supernatural entities," it continued, its voice taking on an almost professorial tone, despite its inhuman nature. "It's a carefully maintained embassy, a neutral ground where our kind can interact with yours safely. The rules you followed so faithfully maintain that neutrality, ensure that neither side violates the ancient agreements that prevent catastrophic collisions between incompatible forms of existence." I began to understand the true magnitude of what I'd done. The Moonlight Gas Go wasn't just a business serving strange customers. It was a diplomatic outpost, a carefully negotiated treaty between two fundamentally incompatible forms of reality, and I'd just committed an act that could be interpreted as a declaration of war. "What happens now?" I asked, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice despite the terror coursing through my system like liquid fire. More shapes began to emerge from the shadows that had gathered in corners and spaces that shouldn't exist. Other creatures, other forms of alien existence that had been waiting in the gaps between seconds for this moment to arrive. I understood now that the storage room sounds had never been trapped victims or inventory disturbances. It had been a gathering place, a space where these beings congregated while waiting their turn to interact with the human world, according to carefully negotiated protocols. "You've served us well, Derek Thompson," the first creature said, its voice carrying something that might have been genuine regret. "You showed respect to beings that most of your kind would flee from in gibbering madness. You maintained the balance faithfully for 21 days, longer than many who came before you. Your dedication earned you privileges that previous clerks never achieved." The other entities moved closer, and I could see them more clearly now that the protective barriers had fallen. They were beautiful and terrible in ways that human language couldn't adequately describe. Beings of living shadow and crystallized starlight. Creatures that looked like geometric equations given physical form. Entities that existed as pure mathematics made manifest in dimensions my eyes could barely perceive. "But the rules exist because the consequences of breaking them are absolute," the first creature continued. "You've seen us as we truly are, gazed into realities that aren't meant for human consciousness. And knowledge cannot be allowed to return to your world unchanged. The compact demands balance, and balance requires sacrifice." I felt a strange sense of acceptance wash over me as I finally understood the full scope of my situation. After 3 weeks of following arbitrary-seeming rules that made no logical sense, I finally comprehended their true purpose. They weren't just instructions for staying safe. They were the terms of a cosmic treaty that kept two incompatible realities from destroying each other through mere proximity. "Will others come after me?" I asked, thinking of Mrs. Holloway and her seemingly endless supply of new employees. Will this place continue to serve its purpose? Always, the creature replied, with certainty that transcended doubt. There will always be those among your kind who need the work, who crave the solitude that night brings, who can learn to follow rules they don't understand for reasons they can't comprehend. And there will always be those who can maintain the balance long enough to move on to other responsibilities. The lights went out completely, plunging the store into a darkness so absolute it seemed to have physical weight and texture. In that blackness, I heard movement all around me, not just from the creatures I'd seen, but from others that had apparently been waiting just outside the boundaries of normal perception. But something unexpected happened in those final moments before my human existence ended. Instead of the pain and terror I'd anticipated, I felt a strange transformation beginning to take hold of my consciousness. The creatures weren't destroying me in the conventional sense. They were changing me, incorporating me into their alien existence in ways that preserved something essential while fundamentally altering everything else. Your faithful service has earned you something unprecedented, the first creature explained, as reality dissolved around me like sugar in water. Previous rule breakers faced simple termination, their violations of the compact requiring complete erasure from the dimensional record. But your dedication, your respect for the balance, your genuine understanding of the responsibilities you'd undertaken, these things have earned you a different kind of payment. My consciousness began to expand beyond the boundaries of human perception, stretching across dimensions I'd never suspected existed. I could see the true nature of the Moonlight Gas Go now. Not just a building constructed of mundane materials, but a nexus point where multiple realities intersected according to principles that made conventional physics look like children's games. The gas station existed simultaneously in dozens of different dimensions, each one requiring careful management to prevent catastrophic interactions between incompatible forms of existence. I could perceive the delicate negotiations that had created this space, the centuries of trial and error that had resulted in the 7 rules that governed interaction between humans and entities like the ones surrounding me, and I understood my new role in maintaining that cosmic balance. Mrs. Holloway found the store empty the next morning, just as she'd found it 46 times before over the past 15 years. My uniform was folded neatly on the counter next to the cash register, which balanced perfectly to the penny. The security cameras showed me working normally until 2:23 a.m., then went completely black until dawn, when the automatic systems resumed recording. She stared at the footage for a long time, her weathered hands trembling as she ejected the tape and locked it away in a filing cabinet with dozens of others, each one documenting the final moments of a night clerk who'd learned too late that some rules exist for reasons beyond human comprehension. By noon, a new help wanted sign hung in the window, its bright yellow background and bold black letters cheerfully advertising an opportunity that most people wouldn't survive long enough to regret accepting. She spent the afternoon interviewing candidates, finally settling on David Carson, a young man who claimed to prefer working alone during the quiet hours and needed the money to pay off student loans. There are specific procedures for the night shift, she explained, reaching for the familiar laminated card that had survived more employees than she cared to count. 7 rules you must follow exactly. Not approximately, not when convenient, not when they seem unnecessary. Exactly. David read through the list with the same progression of expressions she'd seen dozens of times before. Amusement giving way to confusion, confusion becoming concern, concern transforming into the kind of nervous laughter people use when confronted with situations their rational minds can't process. These seem unusual, he said, studying the card as if it might reveal hidden meanings through concentrated attention. Are they really necessary? Some of them seem pretty arbitrary. Mrs. Holloway leaned forward across her desk, her pale blue eyes holding the weight of decades spent maintaining an impossible balance between competing realities. David, I need you to understand something that might save your life. These aren't company policies designed to make your job more difficult. They're not practical jokes or hazing rituals created by board management. These rules are the only thing standing between you and forces that exist beyond human comprehension. She gestured towards the empty store, where afternoon sunlight streamed through windows that had witnessed transformations no human mind should be asked to process. This place serves customers that aren't entirely human, handles transactions that involve more than simple exchanges of money for goods. The rules you're holding maintain a balance that keeps both sides of those transactions safe. David studied the card again, this time with the seriousness it deserved. What happens if I break one of the rules? That depends on which rule you break, how severely you violate it, and whether you're willing to learn from the consequences, she replied, choosing her words with the care of someone who'd explained these concepts many times before. Some mistakes can be survived if the violation is minor and quickly corrected. Others, she gestured again toward the empty store. Others require a different kind of payment. He nodded slowly and slipped the card into his wallet next to his driver's license and a credit card he hoped he wouldn't need to use for emergencies. As Mrs. Holloway walked him through the basic operations of running a convenience store during the most isolated hours of the night, she found herself offering the same silent prayers she'd whispered for every night clerk over the years. That he would be careful, that he would follow the rules exactly, and that perhaps this time the outcome might be different. But as darkness fell across the Nevada desert and David began his first shift alone in the fluorescent-lit island of the Moonlight Gas Go, she knew the truth with the certainty that comes from 15 years of watching the same cycle repeat itself. The store would continue to serve its unusual clientele. The rules would continue to protect those wise enough to follow them without question, and somewhere in the spaces between worlds, the entities that had once been human would continue their eternal watch over the cosmic boundaries they'd sworn to protect. I'm one of those watchers now, existing in the liminal spaces between realities where the rules of physics become more like gentle suggestions and time flows according to principles that predate the formation of galaxies. My consciousness spans dimensions that human language lacks words to describe, and my responsibilities extend far beyond the simple gas station where my transformation began. Sometimes I manifest as the scratching on the roof, warning new clerks about the importance of the radio protocol through sounds that carry messages encoded in rhythms older than human civilization. Sometimes I'm the voice in the static whispering reminders about coffee machine schedules and bathroom door policies to employees who think they're hearing equipment malfunctions or atmospheric interference. And sometimes when a night clerk shows the same dedication to the rules that I once demonstrated, I find ways to help them succeed where I ultimately failed. The compact allows for such interventions, small acts of guidance that don't violate the greater balance but can mean the difference between survival and transformation for those brave enough to work the night shift. David Carson lasted 4 months before his own moment of carelessness arrived. He was followed by Jennifer Walsh, who managed 6 months before breaking the bathroom rule during a moment of human compassion that cost her everything she'd once been. After her came Michael Torres, who survived an entire year before looking directly at a 3 a.m. customer during a brief lapse in attention brought on by personal problems that seemed insignificant compared to cosmic responsibilities. Each time, Mrs. Holloway would find the store empty at dawn, a uniform folded neatly on the counter, and security footage that went black at the crucial moment. Each time, she would place a new help wanted sign in the window and begin the cycle again, hoping that perhaps the next employee would be the one to break the pattern and survive long enough to retire to a normal life. But the rules remain constant, refined through decades of trial and error into their current perfect form. The balance continues, maintained by treaties written in languages that predate human speech, and enforced by beings who understand the true cost of cosmic peace. The Moonlight Gas Go serves as a beacon in the desert darkness, a place where impossible things become routine, and the boundary between worlds grows thin enough to allow controlled interaction between incompatible forms of existence. For those brave enough or desperate enough to work the night shift, it offers employment unlike any other, a chance to serve as guardian of cosmic boundaries, keeper of interdimensional peace, protector of balances that keep multiple realities from destroying each other through mere proximity. Just remember, if you ever find yourself reading a laminated card with 7 simple rules, that following them exactly isn't just about keeping your job or earning your paycheck. It's about keeping your humanity, your sanity, your place in the reality you've always known as home. The rules exist for reasons that transcend human understanding, written in the accumulated wisdom of those who came before and paid the price for learning their importance too late. They've been refined through decades of trial and error, adjusted and perfected by beings who understand the delicate mechanisms that keep incompatible worlds from colliding in catastrophic, mutual annihilation. Follow them exactly, without question or hesitation, and you might survive long enough to find different employment in a reality where the customers are reliably human, and the biggest supernatural concern is whether the coffee machine needs cleaning. Break them, even once, even for the most understandable and human of reasons, and you might discover that death isn't the worst fate that can befall someone who sees too much, learns too much, understands too much about the true nature of the cosmos and humanity's small place within it. The choice, as always, is yours to make, but choose carefully with full understanding of what you're risking and what you're protecting. Some mistakes can't be undone, some knowledge can't be forgotten, and some prices, once paid, can never be refunded. The desert remembers everything. The night shift at Moonlight Gas Go is always hiring. And somewhere in the spaces between worlds, 47 former employees continue their eternal watch over boundaries that must never be crossed and balances that must never be disturbed. Welcome to the team. Try not to look directly at the customers between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. Your survival may depend on it.